What's up, Cyrus? How are you? Pretty good. Pretty good. Thanks. Good. Me too. Monty? What's up? Yeah. Can you... There's no rush to finish this. There's no rush. All right, it's 2 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being on time today. That is much appreciated. We're going to cover the second part of chapter 14 today. Make sure to go ahead and submit your attendance if you haven't already. So we're going to talk about leadership traits, behaviors, and styles. A lot of cool stuff in this chapter as well. Before we do, so a couple interesting responses to our Halloween costumes that I'll share. Well, just a couple. I didn't make a slide for this. My least favorite was Arlette's. She said she went as the scariest thing she could think of, and that was a Bears fan. So unfortunately for her, her grade just tanked. I think Heidi was Boo from Monsters, Inc. I thought that was pretty adorable. And then Matt was Jesse Pinkman. That was pretty cool. If you want to upload your Halloween costume for the selfie on the last attendance, you can do that as long as it's appropriate to be shown in front of a bunch of people. So if you wore something skimpy, I don't need to see that. But like if Matt, you want to put yours on there, that'd be cool to see. Arlette, keep yours to yourself, please. All right, so let's go ahead and begin with chapter 14. We're talking about behaviors and styles of leadership. First thing we'll talk about are the different traits. Early on, when we talked about leadership research, like in the early 1900s, it was focused on what are the traits of a successful leader. If you think of like Abraham Lincoln, that was a pretty common example as an effective leader in leadership research. They said, what are the traits that he demonstrated? It's like he was honest, he was strong-willed, and we said, all right, if you want to be a good leader, you have to be those things. So we'll talk about some of the traits that we maybe initially thought of as being associated with leadership and some that are still true today. Let's jump into that. These are the traits that were positively and negatively associated with being an effective leader. We've seen almost all these except for the dark traits, and we'll talk about those in just a sec. But in terms of being a good leader, if you look at the left 2 columns, there's the task-oriented traits and then the relationship-oriented traits or the interpersonal traits that are effective for both aspects. If you want to be a good leader, you have to be good at your job. That's tasks, and also good with people. You have to have good people skills. So that's the middle column there. But some of the traits they found, that are associated for task work is intelligence. That makes sense. If you're smarter, you tend to be better at like doing jobs. Conscientiousness, which is one of our big 5 personality traits. If you're more detail-oriented and dutiful, you tend to do better work. Openness to experience, emotional stability, and positive affect. So all these things make you better at your job. And when it comes to dealing with people, these 3 are effective. So being extroverted and agreeable, those are 2 of our big 5 personality traits, and showing emotional intelligence. Okay, we talked a lot about how being emotionally intelligent can help you connect with people. You can read their emotions, manage your own emotions. That goes a long way to keeping relationships positive. The 3 that we have not talked about yet are the negative interpersonal attributes. So narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. We've probably heard of at least one of these, narcissism, right? But the other 2 maybe we're less familiar with. We'll define these in just a sec, but just know that these are bad. If you want to be an effective leader, these tend to not be super useful. So here are the definitions. They're not underlined or bolded, but these are nice to know terms. So if you are considered a narcissist, that means you're self-centered, you have feelings of superiority, a drive for personal power and glory. That's the one we're probably most familiar with because we probably know people in our lives that are narcissistic, or we think of them as self-centered. Machiavellianism, this means we display a cynical view of human nature. We condone opportunistic and unethical ways of manipulating people, putting results over principles. So if you're a Machiavellian, you'll do whatever it takes. You'll take advantage of people as long as it means like you get what you want. This is actually a predictor of people who become leaders. They tend to be more Machiavellian. I think that's the right adjective, because they're more willing to like take advantage of others to get success. So because of that, they tend to be viewed as leaders by upper management. We're like, oh, that person's really standing out. They're really getting above and beyond everyone else in their group. So maybe we should make them a leader. All right, and then last, psychopathy. That's a popular term around this time of the year, related to Halloween. So psychopaths have a low concern for others, or really a lack of concern is what defines them. They're impulsive. They lack remorse when they harm other people. Basically, they have zero empathy. So if they killed somebody, that's like what psychopaths do stereotypically, then they don't feel bad about it. So they don't mind to continue to kill people. Most people, if you killed somebody, you would feel horrible, and you would turn yourself in, or you would feel depressed and anxious the rest of your life. Psychopaths do not feel that. I'm just curious. We'll do a real quick show of hands. Who would consider themselves a narcissist in this room? Even a little bit. Not a single person. Yeah, you do? Yeah. I would consider myself a bit of a narcissist as well. If you can be aware of it, you can manage it and not be a douche publicly. I was told in college by my friends that I was a narcissist, and I faced some brutal reality. But once you're aware, you can get better. What about Machiavellian? Is probably a little less common. Would anyone consider themselves Machiavellian? Any psychopaths out there want to own up to being a psychopath? All right, we got a couple. All right. What if you're none of them? That's kind of the goal. The goal is to be none of these things. But the reality is, like, all of us have a little bit of a tendency, well, most of us have a little bit of a tendency for one or more of these things. So, all right. Again, avoid these if you want to be an effective leader. Let's talk about next, gender and leadership. A lot of research on differences between men and women in terms of leadership. For one thing, in terms of how well they're represented, like, are there an equal number of men and women CEOs? The answer is no, but it's getting better. So if you look 30 years ago at Fortune 500 companies, there were 0 women CEOs, despite half of the workforce being women. Now it's better, but they're still outnumbered by men in top management positions. A lot of that is a result of lifestyle demands. It's like men don't have to take off of work to have a baby. That sets back women's career on average. What we do know is that when men and women have the same leadership positions, they are equally effective, but they're equally effective with different forms of leadership. And again, these are averages, so it's not true that all women are like this and all men are like this. But what they found is that men tend to be more directive, so more like authoritarian and assertive and extroverted. So they give directions and they're super confident that their way is the right way. And in general, women tend to use more participative leadership styles, so like more democratic styles of leadership. They're more willing to listen to subordinates for insights and accept that maybe their answer isn't the most correct answer. Okay. What's interesting, though, is that regardless of the style that's selected, they can both be equally effective. What's also interesting is that research is now looking at what if men adopt a participative and women adopt an assertive, and there tends to be penalties if you go against gender norms. So if you're a guy and you try to be super communal and participative, people are like, what are you doing? And if you're a woman and you're very assertive, the same reaction. Okay. I think one takeaway from this, aside from just like gender and leadership, is that leadership styles, there's a lot of them, and they all can be effective if you use them well. So don't try to be a stereotypical leader. Let's talk about some knowledge and skills that are important for being a leader or being in management in general. So we have cognitive, interpersonal, business, and conceptual skills. This looks pretty similar to something I think we covered in chapter 1. It was like, if you are a frontline employee, you have to be good at task skills, and the higher up the chain you get, the more you have to be good at business and conceptual skills. It's the same kind of logic here. So to be a good employee, you have to have good cognitive abilities. So can you like identify problems? Can you adapt to rapidly changing situations and do your job successfully? That doesn't mean that you're necessarily leading other people. You're just good at problem solving. So that's like kind of criteria number one. Then if you want to start to become, if you want to climb the chain of management, you have to have interpersonal skills, because if you don't, you're not going to get promoted. In a lot of cases, if you don't, you're also not going to get hired, period. People want to work with people that they like. And interpersonal skills are particularly useful for leaders. So the ability to influence and persuade others using skills like emotional intelligence, social intelligence. So it's super important to start your climb up the chain of command. Then as you get higher up, you need business skills to maximize organizational assets. So we start to talk about like strategic management in terms of how do we move the right pieces to the right space to make the organization most effective and efficient. And then at the highest level, we have conceptual skills. It's synonymous with critical thinking. So if you're good at critical thinking, this is you. So you might use this drafting the mission, vision, strategies, and implementation of plans. So with that, which of these do you think is most important for upper management? Eric? Yeah. Yeah. Anyone disagree with that? Okay, I agree with that. And so does the research. So the more conceptual skills you have, the easier it is for you to run a company, for example. I remember when we talked about like tactical planning, and then it was like short term versus medium term versus long term. The long term involved a lot of conceptual critical thinking skills, like mapping out our plan. And that's what you need for your CEO to have. Oh, all right, here's a nice formatted diagram of what we just discussed. So those are our 4 skills. Here's kind of like why they're useful. So for example, you have to be able to work with diverse people to be a good leader. So you need interpersonal skills. All right, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. Let's start talking about leadership behaviors. There are a lot of behaviors that leaders have. There's really 2 categories of behaviors you can demonstrate: task-oriented and relationship-oriented at the like really basic level. And what's interesting is that there are 2 different streams of research. This is like the mid 1900s, like 1950 to 1970, at Ohio State University and Michigan, and they both found that these 2 categories of behaviors were the same in both of their research studies. So they both said that leaders tend to focus on tasks in terms of getting things done effectively and efficiently, and leaders also tend to focus on relationships in terms of like supporting and empowering and networking with their subordinates. They have different labels, and the labels are not important, but this is probably the most common if you get into leadership research. The Ohio State University, they said that task-oriented behaviors, they call them initiating structure. So it's like you have your subordinates and you say, here's the task, here are the guidelines, here are the expectations, and giving them structure. That's the task-oriented stuff. And then consideration is like, I'll listen to you, I'll support you, I'll give you development opportunities. That's the relationship-oriented side of things. Okay. But again, the key, kind of the cool takeaway here is that both universities independently came up with the same framework, and it shows that it's kind of generalizable, at least in American management. So question for y'all. As a leader, do you think it's better to have more task or relationship-oriented capabilities? Or another way to think of it, should I use one or the other? Connor? Okay, that's a good answer. What do you think it depends on? Okay. All right, that's a really good answer. Yes, it depends. Here is an interesting chart about how it depends in different situations. This is a lot of information, and I don't want you to stress out and try to memorize this chart. But it's a cool reference to think about when should I use more task-oriented and when should I use more relationship-oriented behaviors. This is it's really called the contingency model. So contingent on the situation, use what's most appropriate. And the way that they break it down, at least in this framework, is that they say there are these 3 factors to consider: your leader-member relations. So it's like, are you on good terms with your subordinates, or are you not on good terms with them? Task structure. It's like, how structured is the task? Is it really clear-cut, or is it very ambiguous? And then position power. Like, do you have really strong authority here? Are they going to respect and listen to you, or do you have less power in this situation? And based on the combination of those 3 things, you figure out which one you should use more. So just as a random example, if you have good relations, but it's a very ambiguous task, low structure, and you have strong position power, this would be situation number 3. And you could use more task-oriented behaviors in that situation. I think one interesting takeaway is that if you're either in a really high control situation or a really low control situation, then you might want to focus more on tasks. But if you're somewhere in the middle, maybe relationship will work better in that situation. Last thing I'll say is that this is not like a golden standard. You shouldn't just refer to this chart if you're having issues and then go with that, because there are a lot of other situational factors in addition to these 3 that you have to consider. So when we say management is an art, that's what this means. There's a lot of things you have to consider when you choose your approach to directing people. It's very difficult. Here's a good question. Let's say early on in your leadership career, you're finding that you keep choosing approaches based on the situation, and you're finding that you're not being very effective. What can you do to improve? Let's say you keep picking the wrong approach and your subordinates are not liking your leadership style. What do you think? Any ideas, Cotter? Nice. That's a really good solution. So he said, ask them, like, hey, is something not working here? Am I doing something wrong? And in my experience, I've worked with a lot of young leaders who were in their first leadership role. A lot of them tend to assume that it's the follower's fault or the subordinate's fault. Like, hey, I think I'm doing the right thing, and they're just not listening, or they're lazy, or they're neglecting their job duties. But a lot of times you can learn a lot just by thinking about, what am I not doing well? And a good way to do that is to ask them. You can also, if you're really self-aware and self-critical, you can reflect yourself and think like, all right, what could I have done differently in that situation? So I think to tie that back to my other key point here, like it's really hard to pick the right approach in all situations, but if you practice it and you reflect on how you're doing, then you're going to get better each time you do it. So eventually you'll start to become a better leader, even if you suck at first. All right, let's talk more about some situational approaches. It's a little different than contingent. This is the path goal model, which says very explicitly, if you remove obstacles in an employee's path to success, then they can reach their goal. So give them a clear path and they reach their goal. That's why it's called path goal model. There are a lot of things to consider here. So we've been looking at so far, what are the leaders' behaviors? So are we like facilitating work, providing structure? Are we providing consideration and support for our employees? But a lot of obstacles occur down the path to success. Some of the obstacles are employee characteristics. So for example, if an employee has a very low internal locus of control, remember they have an external locus of control, so they blame everyone else for their mistakes and they're not getting better. If I notice that as a leader, then I have to correct that so they can be successful. So I'll help them maybe just by talking to them and say, like, you got to take responsibility. Maybe they lack experience. Maybe that's holding them back from success. So I give them some training opportunities to help them be successful. But there can also be some environmental factors like work group dynamics. Maybe they're working with somebody that they hate. So maybe I switch up the groups to make it more effective for them. The takeaway is that I have to figure out what's the obstacle for the employee, and then how can I remove that so they can be successful. Cool. All right. So let's talk some general takeaways from what we discussed so far. When it comes to different leadership approaches, as with most things we discussed so far, you can think of it as a tool in your toolkit. So you can pick out any approach you want, apply it in different situations. You'll start to see how certain approaches will work better in certain situations. But our goal is to make sure people have what they need to succeed. All right. Talk about now styles of leadership. There are many, many styles of leadership. So far we talked about traits and like behaviors. When we talk about styles of leadership, for example, have y'all heard of transformational leadership? Yeah, it's probably the most popular. When you think of like Martin Luther King Jr., he was a transformational leader. He's one of the probably most used examples in leadership courses. But when we think about these styles of leadership, it's more like a lifestyle. It's like this leader tends to act this way in all aspects of their management, and that's what makes them effective. So it's kind of more broad than just discrete behaviors and traits. I think it'll make more sense as you see different styles. The first two we'll talk about are transactional and transformational. These are the oldest and probably the most popular. Transactional is one of the first styles of leadership. It works on the assumption that we have transactions to motivate people to work hard. So for example, if I want you to do your job, I'll engage in a transaction where I pay you in exchange for your labor. Like that's a very simple economic transaction. That kind of lost popularity when transformational leadership came along. It says we do more than just like give people things so they work hard. It's not just rewards and punishments we use. But transformational leaders transform the employees. That's the action verb there, through a lot of different ways, but essentially it's very idealistic. So like we're motivational, we're inspirational. We get people to do their best and be their best person. That's what a transformational leader does. If you think about like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, he didn't just give people things to do what he wanted. He inspired them to do things because they wanted to do it. One takeaway is that if you've learned about these before, tend to be presented as a dichotomy. So like you're either transactional or you're transformational. Either you motivate people with rewards and punishments, or you motivate people with inspiration. But the reality is, if you're a really good leader, you use both. So using rewards and punishments is very effective. Remember, we talked about our 6 bases of power: reward and coercive power. Those are very effective in motivating people. But if we can use both, transactional and transformational, then we're going to be the most effective leader. Cool. Let's look at these 4 behaviors of transformational leaders. These are what kind of define someone who's transformational. These are the 4 I's because they all start with the letter I. So inspirational motivation, idealized influence, individualized consideration, and intellectual stimulation. So if you're good at inspirational motivation, you help people buy into the vision that transcends them and gets them to buy into the org's goals. Idealized influence says we can be something even better. We're here to do the right thing. Individualized consideration, give people like specific support for them to develop themselves. And then intellectual stimulation is, let me describe the great challenges we can conquer together. So these are all very motivational things if you can get people to buy into your message. I gave you one example. So Martin Luther King Jr. is a good example. Can y'all think of any other famous people that you would call transformational? Okay, Jackie Robinson. I like that. Any others? Yeah. Sorry? Malcolm X? Yeah, okay, that's good. Mother Teresa is another really commonly used example. Gandhi. Here's one that's very controversial. I mentioned earlier in the semester, Hitler. Would y'all consider him transformational? Yeah. He was incredibly transformational, also incredibly immoral. But he created a vision for Germany that made people do things that they would never otherwise do. That's actually why transformational leadership lost steam in the last 20 years, is because people realized, oh, like you can do this for very unethical reasons. If you think about Wolf on Wall Street, have y'all seen that? It's a really good movie about someone who becomes this like idealized figure and makes people do really shitty things. So while this is a very good form of leadership because it's very inspirational, it has to be used for ethical means. So, and that's one of the main points here. A couple of the main points. It's very useful, but it has to be used for ethical reasons. All right. So let's talk about some other forms of leadership here. So LMX, leader-member exchange, servant leadership, and the power of humility, humble leadership. A couple more. Empowering leadership, abusive leadership. So lots of leaderships. If you want to study leadership, you can just put an adjective in front of leadership and make it a new style of leadership. Okay, LMX is probably one of the most popular. It's technically a theory of leadership, but it describes how if we have good quality social exchange between leaders and followers, that's like, do they have good relations? Do they respect each other? Do they like each other? Then it's a much better situation in terms of task performance. Like those subordinates work harder. The leader gets more benefits. The follower gets more benefits. So the quality of the relationship is called leader-member exchange. And you could also refer to it as relational exchange. The things they are exchanging are loyalty, respect, liking, and professional contributions. So it's really like those four things. And that represents a really good working relationship between the leaders and their followers. The interesting thing about this theory is that it says that leaders cannot have the same quality relationship with everybody because, like, let's say you have 30 subordinates. It's just impossible for you to like give 30 people everything you got. So what we tend to see is that certain followers are in the in group where they get more or higher quality LMX, and certain followers are in the out group, they get lower quality LMX. Some of y'all mentioned favoritism a couple weeks ago, and that's a good example of LMX at its extreme, where one person stands out and they kind of get extra attention. Cool. All right, so that is LMX. This is less of a style of leadership. This is like everyone has LMX. So think about your leader. Like if y'all work, I think a lot of y'all do. Raise your hand if you like your supervisor and you have a good relationship with them. Oh, that's pretty good. That's a really good sign. Anyone have a shitty relationship with your supervisor? A really bad relationship? All right. That's good. More of you have good relationships than bad relationships. Okay, so that's we'll talk about. Second, we'll talk about a servant leadership. This one, if you didn't know, y'all know Sandy Wayne? She's our dean. Her husband, Bob Lydon, they were both faculty here. They've been here since the 90s, and they are like the world's leading scholars in servant leadership. So if you go to a management conference in America or even in Europe or in Asia, and you mention Bob and Sandy, they're super famous because of servant leadership, in part. So this one's really famous, and the idea of it is that it's all about serving the needs of the followers and the organization, and prioritizing those over the needs of the leader themselves. So we tend to think of leaders as like, yeah, they're advancing the org's goals, they're also advancing their own personal goals, and sometimes they have to take advantage of subordinates to accomplish the org's goals. And servant leadership says you shouldn't take advantage of subordinates, because if you like empower them and you support them and you develop them, then not only is their life better, but also they work harder. So it's not supposed to be manipulative, but it does actually advance the org goals by also advancing the subordinates goals. All right, so it's all about serving followers and org. These are some of the behaviors that are associated with that. So listening, particularly listening to subordinates, empathizing with others' feelings, focusing on healing suffering. So for example, if your subordinates come into work and I think Norelli gave an example, like your friend's mom died or something, and the boss was like, well, I don't care. Like, you're working late tonight. That would not be an example of this. Having high self-awareness, using persuasion, conceptual skills. So the conceptual skills we mentioned earlier are super important to this. Servant leaders can also, I wouldn't say predict, but they're more forward thinking in terms of future outcomes. And probably the most important part of this, the most definitional part, is that they are stewards of the employees and the org's resources. So like they feel like it's their responsibility to make sure people have what they need to succeed, that the organization succeeds. Something that's not on here, I guess it is on here down here, is this focus on serving the community as well. So servant leaders, I've already said, focus on followers in the organization, but also the community more broadly becomes a priority for them. So that might include facilitating volunteer efforts for the employees. Like, let's go organize Thursday night at the soup kitchen. And that's something they might do. Cool. All right. LMX and servant leadership are overwhelmingly positively supported in the research. So if you do these things, followers like enjoy their job, they work harder, they stay longer. Why do you think these are good things? Why would LMX and servant leadership be a good thing for your followers? Any thoughts on that? And really? Yeah, totally makes sense. And you're definitely right. If you do these things, people will like their job more, they'll like you more, and they'll work harder. Mike, were you going to say something different? Yeah, that's very much true. That also gets into the bigger picture here of that, like, we're giving people things. Obviously, that makes them like us more. But just the fact that we're giving people resources like loyalty and respect and support and development, then they feel obligated to give us things in return. For one thing, because they like us, but also they just feel some kind of mutual obligation. If you remember social exchange theory, I think we mentioned that like week 1 or 2, that if we give people things, they want to give us things in return. That is a huge outcome for these two styles, LMX and servant leadership. Again, I'll stress that that's not the goal. So you shouldn't be servant because you want people to do things for you. You shouldn't be like, hey, Amari, let me give you some help here, man. Now, what can you do for me? Because that seems kind of manipulative. People will not respond well to that. So it should be because you want to do the right thing. That actually makes it more effective. All right. Enough about those two. Let's talk about humble leadership. I'm not a huge fan of this one because it's kind of, I don't know. If you have good LMX and good servant leadership, you will also be humble. However, there's a separate stream of research that says humble leadership is a different style. Essentially, it means you are a humble person. So you prioritize like the greater good over your own good. You're not concerned about ego or getting what you want. Five key qualities are self-awareness, openness to feedback, appreciation of others, low self-focus, and appreciation of the greater good. So essentially, you're willing to not get all the credit and give it to others. Okay. I would say humble leadership is technically a style that's researched, but really, if you want to be a good leader, think about just being humble. Like that should be a part of your leadership style, just being a humble person. All right. Empowering leadership is pretty similar, and that empowering is something we should do as leaders. So if I empower my employees, I want to give them some autonomy and control over their work. If you remember the job characteristics model, autonomy is one of the 5 things that make people more motivated. And if I empower them, they will feel more autonomy and motivation. Okay. So I create this sense of psychological empowerment, which means they believe they have control over their work. And if they feel that way, then they work harder, they get more done. This is empowering as one of the behaviors of servant leaders. So if you are a servant leader, you are empowering your employees by definition. All right, another style, ethical leadership. This was really popular right after the fall of transformational leadership. Remember I said that transformational leaders can be unethical, like Hitler? This was became really popular as a result of that, and it said that leaders need to do the right thing. So if you think of like, I don't know, Wolf on Wall Street or the Enron example, or the Lehman Brothers, there's a lot of situations in American organizations where leaders have done the wrong thing in order to maximize profits. And this says that we should do the right thing rather than prioritizing profits over morality. Okay. If you're an ethical leader, you demonstrate ethicality, you punish people who act unethically, you make sure it's clear that people understand ethical standards. Those are really important to making sure that the organization stays ethical. Just like empowering leadership, ethical leadership is part of servant leadership. That's actually one of the 7, they're called dimensions. It's like one of the 7 key aspects is being ethical and empowering your followers. Next up, what not to do. So abusive supervision. This one should make some pretty intuitive sense. If your supervisor is abusive, they might use some verbal or nonverbal hostility. This is technically separate from physical abuse in the research, but you can think of it all as basically your supervisor is treating you poorly, and that has a lot of negative outcomes. The research suggests that it's usually caused by a bad org culture. It's like I keep using the Wolf on Wall Street example. It's a good one here because part of that culture was like abuse. And that becomes the norm where we treat people like crap. Could be your leader personality. So if you think of Machiavellianism, that's a pretty key predictor of abuse. If you're willing to take advantage of other people for your own success, you're going to be abusive probably. They've also shown that early life experiences, so like if your parents were abusive, you're much more likely to be an abusive leader. That makes sense. All right, just by show of hands, who's in the past had an abusive leader or someone they felt treated them poorly? Norelli, that's me. All right, I thought there might have been more. Denny, y'all care to share like what was your reaction? If you want to give any insights too, you could like, this is what happened. This is how I felt. Mark? All right, Norelli? Yikes. That is crazy. So what was he doing that made people not want to work with him? Yeah. Yeah. So it's like sexual harassment, borderline quid pro quo. He's trying to give you things. So yeah, that's a very good example of abuse. The result of that, that's a really good example because like people just stop working with him. So that's obviously really bad for not only for your mental health, but also for the organization's success is nobody wants to work for this manager. So All right. Sorry to hear that. Thanks for sharing. So if we're an organization, how do we prevent that from happening? Maybe not that specific example, but like more generally speaking, how do we stop abusive supervision? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Eric? Yeah, so just like having an open line of communication. Yeah, that definitely helps. That also helps with people speaking up if things are going poorly. It's like if, and in Neuroleg's example, if upper management's asking people to like to chat one-on-one, then they can hear about these stories and shut it down. Any other thoughts for stopping abusive supervision? What if you're taking over the Wolf on Wall Street organization where everyone treats each other like shit? Uh, how do you turn that around? Yeah, that's an option. What if you get hired as a CEO? Like, all right, we're bringing you in. We need you to fix this. Then you can't leave. They're paying you $16 million a year. Yeah, you could fire people. You could, yeah. No, not necessarily. I like where you're at. Anything to add to that, Eric? Yeah. All right. I like that. Yeah, just yes. Yeah, that's why actually one of the best ways you can bring about change. Kind of like what I hoped we could get at was changing the culture. I think all those ideas work, especially like firing the bad people and hiring new good people, having a code of ethics so it's very standardized and written on paper what we want to see people do. Those are all super effective. But at the end of the day, we got to change the culture so that it's no longer the norm to be a crappy person. Uh, these are good ideas to add to your papers if you're thinking about suggestions for organizations. A good suggestion for a lot of organizations is to change the culture. And you can suggest things like write a code of ethics. One thing about codes of ethics is that just because you write it doesn't mean it's going to be effective. So you got to write it and then implement it. And then as Hobby's saying, if people don't follow it, fire them. So those are all great examples you can put in your paper. Okay, let's keep going here. Talk for a second about followers, what followers want, what leaders want. I have a quick question. If I use the term followers in place of subordinates, does that sound weird to y'all? Yeah. Yeah. We get that reaction a lot. In research, especially in like servant leadership and leader member exchange, the term follower is used a lot. I think in response to subordinate being derogatory. But when I ask people about followers, they y'all get the impression it's like a cult. Or if not, what is it? Yeah, okay. All right, well, that's just a term we use. You can use subordinate as well. I think a new trend now is to say direct reports. All right, so whatever term you're using, what do direct reports want from their leaders? The research shows they want significance, community, and excitement. So they want to feel like what they're doing is meaningful, that they have a sense of community, and that they have some excitement. If you think back to the job characteristics model, The significance of your task is super important and motivating you. A sense of community gives you like these shared relationships that make your work more enjoyable. Okay, the one thing we're adding here is this excitement level. And then on the flip side, what do leaders want from their followers? These are all things that can make you a really effective and desirable employee. So are you productive? That's kind of the most obvious. Are you reliable? Do you show up to work on time every day? Are you honest, cooperative, proactive, flexible? So that's what the research suggests that leaders want from their followers. All right. Last up, let's take a look at our career readiness model. So pretty much everything, half the words up here are highlighted this chapter. A lot of things are really important, but we're going to focus on self-awareness. So to improve ourselves and preparation for our careers, helping self-awareness. So a few things we can do: take time to reflect, write down your priorities, learn your strengths and weaknesses, be self-critical. If you're a narcissist, be willing to admit it. And then here's one that is super important: the Dunning-Kruger effect. So this basically says we don't know what we don't know. People who are incompetent are unable to realize their own incompetence. So you might see someone who's super confident. They sound like they know what they're talking about, and a lot of times they really don't. So just being aware to your own weaknesses and limitations, that's super important. All right. Any questions? Cool. Let's go ahead and do attendance then. All right, papers are due next week, right? I think next Thursday. Yeah, this is the second one. We're gonna do it again. Yep. All right. Thanks, y'all. Have a good weekend. See you next week. Next Thursday. Yes.